Hello, everyone, and welcome to our RettSyndrome.org RettEd webcast today with Dr. Gill Townend, researcher and augmentative and alternative communication expert with the Rett Expertise Center in the Netherlands and Rett UK, and Dr. Theresa Bartolotta, professor, Department of Speech-Language Pathology, School of Education with Monmouth University and the Monmouth University Graduate Center, who will be introducing to us today the development, final statement, and recommendations of the largest body of evidence-based communication guidelines to be published for Rett syndrome. This work was funded by RettSyndrome.org and was accomplished by a global team of experts and parent contributors. We're so excited to have this information shared with you today. This is Paige Nuez. I'm Director of Family Empowerment at RettSyndrome.org, and I'll be your moderator today. Our board of directors and all of us at RettSyndrome.org want to personally thank you for your support and engagement, especially as we enter the heart of October, Rett Syndrome Awareness Month. Rett syndrome is such a rare disorder, and continuous awareness, empowerment, and research is everything. And I say this as both a parent to a beautiful teenager with Rett syndrome and as your advocate at RettSyndrome.org. Education, connectivity, and advocacy are the necessary ties that bind us together into our rare but mighty Rett community, and you are all showing your engagement in spades on social media this month. Calls, emails, phone calls, donations are pouring into our foundation from people new to our community that have been touched by your awareness posts and are responding to the struggles of our children. And they want to help, so please keep it up, and thank you for engaging. While investing in research towards granting the ultimate wish of a cure leads us at RettSyndrome.org to focus a lot of time and energy in this arena, we remain steadfast in our concern with the health and well-being of our children today. Therefore, we're so pleased to bring you today's presentation from two leading researchers who feel the same and have committed themselves to helping you in the here and now. We're so excited for today's webcast, and I know you are too. But before we begin, I'd like to share some brief tech points on how GoToWebinar operates if this is your first time joining us. The audio feed is open to our presenters only, so you don't have to worry about your background noise interfering with the presentation. If you look to the upper right corner of your screen, you'll see a control panel window. We invite you to type your questions or comments in the question field throughout the presentation, and we will answer these at the end of their presentation, as well as any questions pre-submitted at the time of your registration. If we don't get to your question today, we will work with Gill and Theresa to get all writing questions answered and posted in a QA document to our RettEd webpage once completed. If that control panel window is distracting to you, you can minimize or move the window, then you can expand it at any time if you wish to submit a question. Now, next point, and this is really great, the session is being recorded. We will post a link of the recording along with the QA document to the RettEd webpage so you can listen again or share with others. Being registered for the RettEd, you will get an email directly to your inbox in the next day or two with a link to the recording. Please share it with others. If you're having trouble hearing, please check and turn up the volume on your phone or device. Now, let's turn our thoughts towards our topic for today. Rett syndrome, being an early childhood onset disorder with a prognosis of living well into adulthood, gives all of us a very deep and loving relationship to our loved ones with Rett syndrome. And the underpinnings of this relationship are dependent on us having a true understanding of the nature of the diagnosis and acknowledging the real divide we must cross between the love and dreams for our children and the hope of what science predicts to be the realistic promise of treatments and a cure on the horizon. You came to this meeting today to hear ways to bridge the gap between what we know our children want to say and how we can evoke their best communication potential. I think you'll like what you're about to hear, and that this information will help you even more to be motivated to invest in your children, in yourselves, and our foundation. Dr. Townend and Bartolotta have been collaborating for quite some time with a team of global experts to produce this body of work, and we're eager to hear their results. We'd like to get started. Are you ready?
Yes,
Jill,
I'm
if
ready.
you are ready, great. I will go ahead and turn the screen over to you.
And hopefully you can see my screen now. And also maybe you can see my webcam.
Yes, we can see
Yes.
you We can see you live and your slides. Thank you.
Hello. I'm going to turn my webcam off in a moment, but I thought sometimes it's quite nice just to put a face to a name when people are speaking to you. I don't know whether, Theresa, you want to say hello as well before we get going?
Sure, I'll do that now. This way we don't interrupt later. Hi, everyone. Yeah. We are so excited to be here and share the information that we've gathered over the last few years with you.
Absolutely.
So Jill, you're going to kick us off?
I am indeed, yes. So fantastic that so many of you have been able to join us today. I've just stopped sharing my webcam now so that it doesn't distract you from the information on screen. And hopefully you can see the first slide with the title of the presentation. This will also draw your attention to the fact that Theresa and I are presenting today on behalf of our colleagues in the project, Anna, Helena and Leopold Kerfs. And here you can see the other members of the team as well, although they're not joining us live today. We're very grateful to rettsyndrome.org for the funding that they provided for this project. We initially came together in 2013 at the Third European Conference in Maastricht, and really through a mutual concern over the lack of guidelines for best practice in developing communication skills in individuals with Rett syndrome, and the lack of guidelines for best practice in assessment and intervention, we developed this project and were lucky enough in 2016 to get funding from rettsyndrome.org. I'm sure it comes as absolutely no surprise to any of you listening as to why we felt that guidelines were needed. We were particularly conscious that there was a lack of information, of good quality evidence-based information, and also a huge variety in practices and knowledge and expertise between countries. So a huge variation in terms of the number of experts who specialised in communication and Rett syndrome, and the different kinds of services to which families had access and the supports that they could expect. We put together a project process that really was a very robust and systematic process, a multi-step process that took us through analysis of all of the published literature that had anything in relation to communication, communication assessment, communication intervention, long-term management and development of communication skills in individuals with Rett syndrome. And we supplemented that by developing surveys that we put out for communication professionals and families across the world to complete. Surveys that really asked about the experiences of families and professionals, where they gathered their information from, what kinds of supports and services were offered, what they found to be helpful and what they found to be challenging, and what they would like to see developed in the future. And from the literature and the surveys, we pulled out over 200, in fact almost 300 statements and recommendations for good practice, which we then ran through an expert panel of both professionals and parents to develop in a consensus style a set of guidelines for communication and for best practice in relation to Rett syndrome. And out of those statements and recommendations that form the guidelines, one of the things that we've been working on very hard in recent months is producing a user-friendly handbook that can be taken and used in different countries. So on the slide now, you just get a flavour of the number of people and countries who have been involved in that process over the last couple of years. The surveys that we put out to families were translated into 16 languages. And in total, when you look at the number of families who completed surveys, the number of communication professionals who completed surveys, you look at the number of people in the expert panel and in the core project team, we have over 650 people from 43 countries who have been involved in the production of the guidelines. So certainly no mean undertaking, and we're very pleased to be sharing the guidelines with you today. And we look forward to the handbook that will be available from the beginning of 2020. I have made reference to a handbook. Who is the handbook for? We're intending this to be more user-friendly than just producing a very raw set of statements and recommendations. And we're really aiming for the handbook to be something that parents can take and share with team members who are working with and supporting and caring for individuals of any age with Rett syndrome, wherever they live in the world. Something that parents can use to advocate for evidence-based services. We also see it as something that professionals, whether they be working in health or social care or in education, can use to support their own development of an evidence-based approach to the assessment and intervention of communication when working with individuals with Rett syndrome. And we're seeing it as something that service managers and funders of equipment and services will be able to use to inform the planning and development of services and to inform their decision making around the provision and allocation of resources. So in many ways, we're hoping that the guidelines will be adaptable to different situations and different circumstances. The handbook will not offer a step-by-step instruction that requires all countries and services to follow and apply them in identical ways. It's not, if you like, a recipe book that spoon feeds solutions, but it is something that provides a common baseline of consistent information. And this is really where we're hoping the value of the handbook will be. So what does the handbook include? And this is really what we're going to spend the rest of the webinar talking about and sharing with you today. The handbook has a number of sections, and that begins with a series of guiding principles relating to the rights of the individual with Rett syndrome and the attitudes and beliefs that we can expect or hope to expect from the communication partners, the people interacting with individuals with Rett syndrome. And I'll go on to share some examples of those principles with you in just a few moments. We also look at aspects of professional practice, and we look at features of Rett syndrome that can impact communication. Now, you will find during the handbook that many of the things that are included can be applicable to really anybody who needs augmentative and alternative communication to support their communication or the development of their skills. But in certain places, there will be things that are very specific for individuals with Rett syndrome. And of course, the features of Rett syndrome is one of those areas. We then have a section looking at strategies that can be used to optimize engagement. And again, in just a moment, I'll be sharing some of those strategies with you. Of course, assessment is actually then a big area of the handbook, and we have 3 sections actually that cover assessment. So general principles of assessment, augmentative and alternative communication assessment, and also a section looking at trials of devices or systems that can be seen as a form of ongoing assessment. And then a large section in relation to intervention. Again, beginning with general principles for intervention, and then looking at targets and goals that can be set for intervention, and explanation of specific intervention techniques that can be used. So I'm sure that what you're all interested in hearing about now are some of the things that are included within the handbook, and really putting some flesh onto the bones of what we mean when we talk about each of those different sections. I'm going to move on and talk about the guiding principles a little bit, and also about the features of Rett syndrome and the strategies to optimise engagement. And then I'm going to hand over to Theresa to talk you through the assessment and intervention sections. We actually begin the handbook by referring to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And we also refer to the Communication Bill of Rights that was developed by the United States National Joint Committee for the Communication Needs of Persons with Severe Disabilities. And we look at one of the accessible versions of the Communication Bill of Rights that was produced by Scope in Australia, because there was a very strong feeling coming out of the literature and the surveys, and then through the expert group, that each of these, the conventions and the bills of rights, were very relevant to individuals with Rett syndrome. And from the UN Convention, we actually developed a series of, if you like, communication rights that we feel are applicable to individuals with Rett syndrome. And we share those in the handbook. And in many ways, the rest of the handbook is then unpicking what those rights mean in daily practice, and how they can be applied and adapted in real life. One of the things that really came out very strongly during the research that we undertook is that the potential to communicate is frequently underestimated in individuals with Rett syndrome, and that the level of receptive language or language understanding is usually better than an ability to express oneself. And really, we feel that it's very important for communication partners to have an open mind to the communication potential of the individual with Rett syndrome. When we talk about believing that the individual is capable of communicating, we're really talking about that idea of being open-minded and open to possibilities. Not saying that all individuals will reach the same level of communicative competence, but that everyone should have the opportunities, the supports, and the equipment made available to them to give them the best chance possible to develop and maximise their skills and their potential. So we feel that the guiding principles are very important at the beginning of the handbook for establishing that the grounds for the rest of the recommendations and strategies within the handbook. And I've just got on screen here a quote that we extracted from the professional survey, because I think that's particularly relevant, that the assumption that girls and women with Rett syndrome are severely or profoundly cognitively challenged is extremely damaging to these individuals. While these children and adults likely have neurological differences, their limited access to communication and education is much more disabling than anything else. And what we're attempting to do through the guidelines and through the handbook is to break down those barriers and open up those opportunities. I should also point out that whilst this quote talks about girls and women, we do absolutely acknowledge that Rett syndrome can affect males as well. And in the handbook itself, by and large, the language that we use refers to individuals, not to girls and women, but we do also include quotes where we think it's relevant from the surveys, and it may be that people there have used the language around girls and women because, of course, as you know, Rett syndrome is predominantly in females. When we talk about professional practice, we are intending that the guidelines supplement or go alongside, complement, in fact, any requirements for continuing professional development that any of the professionals working with individuals with Rett syndrome have. So we're not intending to replace professional codes of conduct, but really to reinforce and complement them. We feel from the research and from the evidence of the surveys that it's very important that every individual with Rett syndrome should be supported by a multidisciplinary team as far as possible. We recognise, however, that in certain settings, in certain countries, in certain locations, this may not be possible. But we do recommend that wherever possible, the minimum team is at least a parent or caregiver, the individual with Rett syndrome, and at least one other person. And of course, in this case, somebody with expertise in relation to communication. We also stress that the team should really define their roles and come to an agreement around a common vision, so that they're working collaboratively to define and agree communication goals and support plans, because the best chances of success really come from people having that shared vision and working towards achieving the same goals rather than being at cross purposes with each other. So we do talk a little bit further around professional practice. But I'm going to move on now, given that we have limited time in the webinar, and show you an illustration that we've developed to really exemplify the features of Rett syndrome and the coexisting conditions that can impact communication. Now, I'm sure that none of these features are unfamiliar to you. What you'll notice at the top of the illustration are the boxes in the darker blue text are the core clinical criteria that were defined in the article in 2010 by Jeff Newell and colleagues. And underneath in a paler blue are the commonly reported coexisting conditions that can occur alongside Rett syndrome. Now, we're not intending in any way that the handbook is a substitute medical textbook, but we really have this section on the features to draw attention to the fact that these conditions can and do impact communication, and we need all communication partners to be aware of those features and to take them into account. So in this section of the handbook, we give some brief explanations of the different features and what the impact could potentially be on communication, what signs you might be seeing. And in the following section on strategies to optimize communication, we then look at potential strategies that can be used to counter or combat the effects of these features and coexisting conditions. So moving on now to the strategies to optimize engagement. In this section, we're really talking about strategies that can be used in any interaction moments with individuals with Rett syndrome. So we're not thinking specifically of restricting strategies to therapy or education settings, but to any time or place throughout the day. And one of the things that we look at, for example, is that the communication skills of individuals can fluctuate based on the internal and external factors that we talk about in the previous section. And we feel that it's important to stress that you should expect or can expect inconsistency. So just because somebody communicates well and shows a set of skills on one occasion and then may appear to perhaps have lost those skills or not demonstrate them the following day, doesn't mean that those skills cannot be repeated. It may fluctuate according to somebody's medical status or the effect of their medication or their sleep patterns, etc. And we feel that you need to be aware of that. It's important, of course, to address and talk directly to the individual rather than talking about them in their presence. And that, in many ways, it is something that's just good practice for all of us to bear in mind. There may be times that you need to find out information from a caregiver rather than from the individual. But there should always be ways that you can use to explain that and include the individual in the conversation. There may be times that you deliberately choose to talk to others in the room to give the individual space to explore the communication system or device in front of them without them feeling the pressure of you waiting for them to respond. But that's a different thing, a different strategy to talk when we say don't talk about them in their presence. Make sure that vocabulary, topics and activities are appropriate to the interests of the individual with Rett syndrome is something that we stress rather than specifically saying make sure things are age appropriate. One of the things that is stressed throughout the guidelines and throughout the handbook is that it's really important to get to know that particular individual and to build a relationship with the individual. So it's about making sure really that the vocabulary, the topics and activities are appropriate to them and their interests. And of course, in many cases, we would hope that that also correlates with being age appropriate. But we also know that we each have our own individual interests, and there are times when maybe we would like to do something that we enjoyed when we were younger. But it's very much about getting to know that individual and applying things to them. It's also important to make sure that anybody's AAC system or device is available at all times, and we go on to talk about that further in the intervention section. When the handbook talks about attributing meaning, then again, that is something that we talk about in some detail in the intervention section, how you can give feedback and attribute meaning. And in the strategies to optimize engagement, we look in some detail at issues around sensory regulation and how to identify the signs that an individual may be over or understimulated, and strategies for getting them back to an optimum regulated state. And we refer to, for example, the work by Judy LaRiviera on sensory regulation, and with her permission, we reprint her sensory regulation chart, which we found through the literature and through the surveys to be something that people were finding useful. Another area that we focus on in strategies to optimize engagement is to acknowledge that individuals with Rett syndrome may have a delayed response in their communication interactions, and that this response may range substantially between individuals or between in the same individual at different moments in time. Because of the variation between individuals and between circumstances, we found that it was not really possible to set a specific time limit on how long you should wait to look for a response. But what we did find was that we could give some pointers that would help you to determine a sufficient wait time for any particular individual. So you can see in the bullet points in this box the kinds of pointers or tips that we give in the handbook. So observing the individual, reviewing videos perhaps to identify typical communication behaviours, discussion with familiar communication partners, and also again coming back to this, thinking about the different features of Rett syndrome and the impact that may be having at any one moment in time on an individual. So that was a real kind of whistle-stop tour through some of the early sections of the handbook, and I'm going to pass over the baton to Theresa now to continue talking about assessment.
Thank you, Gill. So I'm going to show my screen, and that should give everyone the opportunity to begin to see our assessment slides. So I'm going to begin with general principles. We identified general principles that can kind of frame the assessment process, and then we have more specific suggestions or recommendations based on the particular individual who's going to be assessed. So beginning, as Gill said before, this focus on communication and advancing communication in individuals with Rett syndrome should be a team process. And certainly assessment should be done by more than one individual. Ideally, there will be a number of different communication partners who are participating in the assessment process and can provide information. These team members will vary based on the different setting that the individual is in, and also the different kinds of resources that are available. At a minimum, again, there should be a communication professional who's part of the assessment that can help guide the overriding process. It is important for team members to understand Rett syndrome in general, and then the individual's particular needs. If you think back to that earlier slide where Gill referenced some of the key features of Rett syndrome that can impact communication, that is why it is very important for individuals who are assessing the person with Rett syndrome to understand what are the core features of this disorder that could be present in that individual, and how can they potentially impact communication. For example, if the person has motor planning problems and there is a specific amount of time the person should wait in order to give the individual with Rett syndrome to provide a response, that is a really key message that those team members need to understand so that they don't say, ask a question or provide a task, and if they don't see a quick answer, they don't assume then the person does not understand or cannot respond. So that's why understanding of Rett syndrome in general is really key for everyone, and then also taking the time to listen to the communication partners of the individual so that they understand how this person functions in their daily life. That will really inform the assessment and yield a valuable assessment that then an intervention plan can be built on. We recommend what we're calling a holistic approach so that you look at the specific skills the individual brings to the assessment process, and then identifying where are their needs, where are the areas where they need intervention, where they need assistance to be more effective communicators in their daily life. We suggest some models around which to structure assessment. The World Health Organization's ICF model about classifying functions can be used to structure assessment, and this particular model considers the whole person, looking specifically at what's happening with the body, what is the impact of any particular disorder or disease state, and how does that manifest in that individual's functioning? What activities are the individual participating in their daily life? What are the factors from the environment that can impact their functioning? And then what are some personal factors? It could be wishes, interests. So you take a very holistic approach to assessment in order to really identify an individual's strengths and then where they have needs. Okay. So I'm having trouble advancing the slides. Let's see.
Theresa, you might have clicked out of PowerPoint if you just click your cursor in your slide, then it should make it active again.
There we go. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay. So as I said earlier, we begin with the broader context and then we come down to the individual. So think about what are the social networks, who are the people, and what are the places this person is interacting with or could potentially interact with, who are their communication partners, who are the persons they're likely to interact with in their home, in their educational setting, in their vocational setting, in the community, and what are those needs? How equipped are the communication partners to be able to communicate with an individual with Rett syndrome? Those are the kinds of things that have to be assessed early on, because you can then build into the intervention process strategies on how to maximize effectiveness. As Gill mentioned earlier, a lot of the things that we have included in the handbook will apply to individuals who are in need of using augmentative and alternative communication. And what you see with individuals who are using AAC, there is a fairly significant role that the communication partner plays in successful communication. Often they may have to know about how to operate a device. How do you present the device so that the user can be successful? So by assessing the needs of the communication partners, team members can then come up with a plan for how to give them the skills they need so that everyone can be successful. Formal clinical settings can be very stressful for any of us, especially for individuals who have special needs. So we recommend that assessment take place in naturalistic settings as much as possible. We recognize there are sometimes burdens on teams. They're not able to get into the home or get into the school, but we have some suggestions on how maybe that kind of information can be brought to a clinical setting if that is what a team is limited to. Remember to assess the medical and the physical status of the person with Rett syndrome, and understanding if there are changes in medical status, if there is acute phase of seizures, for example, or if someone has just had surgery, or if they're undergoing medication changes. Those kinds of things are going to impact communication, and we need to take that into account to recognize that we may be assessing someone in a less than optimal status, if that is correct. So with regard to assessment procedures, the handbook will recommend a number of different types of procedures based on the data we gathered from our research, and we suggest that a team use a combination of procedures, and these would include interviews with communication partners. And the handbook will go into much more detail about what these kinds of procedures should entail. We're going through a very brief overview here. The handbook is quite substantial, many pages, and so we get into lots of detail and give you suggestions on how to do each of these, and we also give resources for you to go to find tools that are already made. So interviews should consider what works, when the person is able to communicate effectively, and also when they are challenged. There are questionnaires that are available that can be adapted for the individual with Rett syndrome. If you are unable to observe the person in their natural setting, teams can ask for brief videotapes of an individual communicating with a familiar partner in a natural setting, or even say in a school setting, so that they can get a sense of the different ways that communication will vary for that individual. Formal assessments. We have some more to say about formal assessments on another slide. They have been considered to be controversial with this population, as is true with other individuals who have complex communication needs. But there are, so they may not necessarily be easily given to an individual with Rett syndrome, but we do understand that there are situations in which a formal assessment may be required for documentation purposes. So we have a nice table towards the end of the document in an appendix with assessments that have been recommended by participants in our research. One of the recommendations that we make is for teams to conduct a dynamic assessment, or use that model. And a dynamic assessment is a multi-step model of assessment where there is a testing opportunity or assessment opportunity at the beginning. So the assessor sees how an individual functions in a particular moment. Then they provide some strategies to try to improve their performance. And then they do and they essentially then do a retest. So it's a test, intervene, retest model. And a quote we have from the professional survey is that a dynamic assessment approach is preferred, where assessment is used to guide intervention. And that's a big takeaway message from this section, is that the information gathered in the assessment process should help define and describe what should be those initial goals and strategies that will be helpful. So here's an example of how to use a dynamic assessment. So say we were asking an individual to tell us about something that they recently experienced. So the test would be asking the individual, tell me what happened when you went to see a movie. And then you would observe the individual, see what their responses are to you, see if they're able to use any system, what kind of body movements, eye gaze, vocalizations, etc. Gather all of their communication behaviors. Then identify what kind of strategies might be helpful to try to elevate their response, to make it richer, to give them the opportunity to convey more. And then after an opportunity where those strategies are demonstrated, you ask the individual the same type of question, and you'd say, well, here, using this core board where I have symbols of the characters from the movie, or you might have a switch where you've recorded a message about the movie. You may have included some increased wait time so you give the person time to organize themselves and give you a response. And then what the assessor does then is assess the impact of those strategies on the response. So as I said earlier, formal assessment tools are often lacking, and a strong recommendation that comes out of our work is that they are not recommended, because we recognize that standard assessments of language and cognition are likely to indicate that individuals with Rett syndrome have an intellectual disability, and they may not accurately reflect their underlying ability or their communicative and learning potentials. So there are ways to adapt formal tests so that the individual can be given the same type of content that the test is trying to assess. Say, for example, a test of vocabulary. But you can use strategies to modify how those test materials are presented so that the individual has actually the opportunity to demonstrate whether or not they understand those particular vocabulary items. And we go into great detail in the handbook on how to do these kinds of things, and we have a list of formal assessments and some suggestions on how to adapt each one of those. But some examples can be that you can take the test items, you can mount them on a board and move them further from each other, so that if the person's using eye gaze, they can actually clearly gaze to particular items. There's also a strategy called partner-assisted scanning that can be used in assessment and intervention. And we go into lots of detail in the handbook on this strategy, which is used with a lot of individuals who use AAC. But basically, in partner-assisted scanning, the partner presents choices and then waits for the individual to convey some type of yes, no. And then there's a strong recommendation that regardless of the skills of the individual, even if they're able to use their hands or they use their body, that you assess their abilities to communicate using eye gaze as a modality, because it has been demonstrated to be so strong for this population. Thinking about informal assessment, using everyday objects, pictures of familiar items, very clear symbols like yes, no symbols, symbols of, say, familiar foods or places, and then using written letters and words is very important. Now, Gill will talk later about access to literacy. We don't want to forget that language is not just oral, it is also written, and we would like to get a sense of the individual's ability to access print, to understand print, so that a plan can be made for advancing their skills in that area as well. And so when the handbook is published, you can look in the appendix for the listing of the formal assessment tools that our participants, who are all very experienced, recommended in using with this population. We then go into specific suggestions for AAC assessment, and we begin with very strong statements about this idea about prerequisites, which has been something that is controversial in the literature in the past. And we begin with strong statements that there are no prerequisite skills that must be demonstrated before aided AAC should be considered. And when we say aided AAC, we're talking about using something in addition to your own body. So any kind of external tool, could be a switch, a picture, or a very complex eye gaze device. It's also very important because we do know that the overwhelming majority of individuals with Rett syndrome will not be functionally verbal, that they should be referred for AAC assessment either at the time of diagnosis or shortly thereafter. And this is a quote that we thought was key for from our survey, that AAC can be introduced for children or adults who are pre-intentional, which means that it looks like they are not able to communicate intentionally. And when I say looks like, that's really important, and have no means to demonstrate cause and effect cognition. AAC can support the development of these skills. So when you do AAC assessment, and again, we go into lots of detail for strategies on how to structure assessment of what is the appropriate type of AAC for an individual. There's lots of symbol systems that are out there. There's so many choices with regard to layout, how complex the vocabulary is, how is the person going to access the device, and how is it going to be positioned. So we'll cover some of that in some of the upcoming slides, but this is the scope of what we discuss. There are models in the literature on how to approach an AAC assessment and consider the opportunities and the barriers that individuals encounter in everyday life. So we provide brief descriptions of these models. These are 3 very common models, and they can assist team members in terms of helping to structure an assessment. And we provide references for further reading about the models in the appendix. So what are some general principles to consider as you move towards AAC assessment? Thinking about the person's health, vision is very key. What kind of memory skills they have, how motivated they are about particular topics, and their experience with communication is going to impact their ability to access eye gaze technology. Personalized assessment activities, even if they don't appear to be interested in communicating, they still may be good candidates. It's just that either we haven't tapped how to engage them, or they have a history of not being successful communicators. It is essential that there are periods where devices are trialed, and we have specific recommendations in for that idea that you cannot just do a one and done, have someone interact with an eye gaze device for, say, an hour and then make a decision as to whether or not this is a useful tool for them. Extended trial periods are key in order to really do a good assessment. And the device must be used with multiple partners in different settings. And you've got to think about specific features of the device and then the individual. There is a model called a feature matching, where you do a needs assessment of the individual and what their skills are, and then you look at the features of different devices, and that's how you can figure out, well, what device is best for this person. And so we talk in the handbook about what is feature matching, and we give a reference for that. So intervention, we wanted to begin with this statement: it is never too early, and it is absolutely never too late. No one is too old to become a communicator. So we have some overriding principles. When you make goals for intervention, you should aim to develop functional skills that will also promote cognition and literacy and improve social communication. And the end goal is to make them an autonomous communicator, so they are as independent as possible. So plan to start early, review goals regularly, and that should be a team effort. So it's not that a parent becomes concerned about someone plateauing. It should be the teacher working together with the therapist, the parent, and any of the clinicians. Provide intervention in a naturalistic context and give them lots of opportunities for practice. Remember, their behaviors are likely to be highly inconsistent. That's where we go back to what's our fundamental understanding of the challenges of Rett syndrome, so expecting 80 or 90% accuracy in order to say that something is acquired is just not realistic. And so we talk about that in the handbook. It is important to develop communication across multiple modalities, and so that means that you think about the different ways that someone could communicate. We all, as verbal communicators or as skilled communicators, use multiple modalities. You use gestures, eye contact, facial expression, writing, speech. So we want to think about maximizing the individual with Rett syndrome's ability to use their own multiple modalities. It is important to target nonverbal, so those are maybe eye contact, facial expression, body movements, gestures, as well as low-tech and high-tech strategies. There's a lot of interest in providing individuals with high-tech devices that have amazing capability. But you should always have a backup to your aided high-tech AAC. They break, they need to go in for repair, they need to be updated, and they're not always accessible at every moment. You can't take them in the pool. Grandma or grandpa may not be able to figure out how to use a high-tech device, but they still want to communicate with their granddaughter. Always have a backup, so a non-electronic version of the high-tech AAC, and that came out of our research. Goals that are set, there's an acronym called SMART, and this is used clinically for communication intervention across populations, and it's a model that goals should be very specific and measurable. This way everybody knows when the goal is achieved, agreed upon so that the team has recommended this is be important, realistic so that they can be achieved within a certain amount of time, and then time-based so that you can begin to see progress in the short term and not have to wait for, say, a year to acquire goals. Establishing a best yes or a yes/no response early is key. We go into what is a best yes. So this can be, in brief, it is the individual's way to convey acknowledgement or convey yes. It may not be hitting an icon that says yes. It can take lots of different forms. So we have examples in the handbook about this and why it is so key to establish that early on in your communication intervention. And then don't just think about teaching someone to request, but communication has multiple purposes. We want them to be able to communicate just like anyone else, to protest, to comment, to ask other people questions as well as answer. We have lots of information about vocabulary, and it's beyond the scope of this webinar to get into the details on vocabulary. There's essentially two ways to go. You can begin with a highly robust vocabulary where an individual is exposed to lots of icons or words or photos, so that there's lots of language that's right there at the ready. Or you can begin with a limited vocabulary so that they start with just a few key icons, get them to be used consistently, and then you grow from there. There's essentially two schools of thought. So we present both of them. We think it might be helpful, at some later date to begin, if we can, to provide some resources on, when might you want to provide a robust vocabulary? When might you want to provide a limited vocabulary? Or if you begin with robust and it's not really going well, then, why would you switch back to limited? And we get into that in much more depth in the intervention section. And then we also provide information on the different kinds of words that you would use. So there's core words, and these are words that come up very frequently on a daily basis and can be used in lots of different situations. And then what's called fringe words, and these are words that just are specific to a particular context. For example, words that you only would use in school, or words you would use at mealtime. So those are fringe words, and you want to have the individual have access to both kinds of words so they can communicate in most situations. And then there is lots of information we provide on how to arrange the vocabulary. And there's different, again, options. You can have a board for school. You can have a board for mealtime. You can have a board for family. And we give you information in the handbook on that. Access is going to vary based on the individual. So you want to, and access is how they activate the device, whether it be direct selection by touching or gazing at the device, or they might have to use scanning, which is when we have the partner assisting them. But for most individuals, eye gaze is going to be the most reliable way that they can access their communication system. So you want to assess that. There's lots of features to consider about eye tracking technology. This eye tracking is not just for people who are non-ambulatory. This can be for folks who are ambulatory, but you want to make sure that they have access to the device so it is positioned in an appropriate way, maybe in a favored location so they can walk over to it. Calibration can be a barrier for some users. So what you want to try to do is do some repositioning. If someone is wearing glasses, you might want to see if maybe the glasses are a problem. So we give some suggestions on how to deal with some calibration challenges in the handbook. Eye tracking can be very fatiguing. So we'll begin with short work sessions and then increase over time. As Jill said earlier, they need access, so have that device turned on and accessible at all times for the individual, right? They always should be able to, quote unquote, talk. And if you have issues with positioning or head control, you want to reach out to physical and/or occupational therapists for their expertise in troubleshooting. And now I'm going to turn it over to Gill, and she'll move on to talk about some of the issues with regard to literacy, and then she'll wrap us up.
Thank you very much. And now you'll just see that I haven't actually whizzed through my screen. Okay, now I'm on the right page. Thank you for that, Theresa. So I'm just going to really wind up the intervention section now and then talk a little bit about what is in the appendices at the end of the handbook, and then we'll be winding up the presentation part of the webinar. So as Theresa said, it was really quite evident from looking at the published literature and from the responses that we got in the surveys that literacy was a key area to consider. We're conscious that it's an area that can be quite controversial. Many people are focused on getting communication off the ground without thinking of adding literacy activities and expectations on top. But actually, it really is something that should go hand in hand with the development of communication, especially if we're working towards an individual becoming autonomous in their own communication. So although it's not a large section in the guidelines, we do have a section on literacy development, and we signpost the Literacy Bill of Rights that was developed by Yoder, Erickson and Copenhaver in 1997. And we provide links in the appendix to free training resources that provide more information in this area. So for example, we provide links to Project Core and the Dynamic Learning Maps websites that have both been developed by the Centre for Literacy and Disability Studies at Chapel Hill. And of course, what we say, as you can see on the screen there, is that exposure to reading, writing, storytelling is beneficial for the development of communication, language and literacy. And then we start to look at some of those individual areas in more detail around developing, for example, phonemic awareness, awareness of print, sight vocabulary and writing skills. And we also, during the intervention section, mention a number of strategies that can be very useful. So some of them, for example, modelling or aided language stimulation, recur a number of times throughout the intervention section. And we both define what those strategies are and we give examples of how to use them. But we also then talk about some other terms, for example, using video modelling or using expanding and recasting techniques, how to use errorless learning or give prompts and cues. So once you see the handbook, you'll see each of those explained and defined in more detail with examples given of how to use them. When we get to the end of the main handbook, we have a number of appendices. The first of these is a glossary of terms. So although we try to make the language accessible in the handbook, by the very nature of the topic, there will be terms that need to be defined and explained to make sure that people really understand what we're talking about. So for example, what do we mean by communication partner? What do we mean by augmentative and alternative communication, or AAC? What do we mean by high tech or low tech, by multiple modalities? So all of those, the first time that they're mentioned in the handbook, they will be defined, but you can also find those definitions again at the beginning of the appendices in Appendix 1 as a quick and ready reference. We then have selected references that have been included throughout the handbook. So when we talk about the Literacy Bill of Rights or we talk about the participation model, you will find the references in the appendix, and you will also find the links to the free resources, as I've just mentioned, for example, to Project Core. Now, we're very aware that for any section on resources, there is going to be a massive variation from country to country. a variation in what is known and available in any particular language or culture. So in many ways, what we have in the appendix at the end of the handbook are some links to resources that we feel are universally helpful to know about, or maybe universally accessible and applicable, maybe things that are available already in multiple languages. But we do recommend that each country produces its own list of resources that can be published alongside the handbook and kept updated alongside the handbook. So when we in the future engage with different countries around perhaps translation of the handbook, we feel it would be useful also to engage with countries on how to compile a list of resources that's relevant for any particular language or any particular country. As Theresa has mentioned, we do have tables that list the formal assessments or the formal tools for tracking development and for monitoring communication goals that were recommended by communication professionals during the survey stages of the project. But we are very conscious that what we're doing really is referring to the tools that people have told us they use and maybe how they adapt them, but we're not firmly endorsing any one particular tool or form of formal assessment through doing that within the handbook. And yeah, finally, we have links to useful websites and organisations. And again, similar to the resources, we signpost certain websites and organisations that we think either have international relevance or we recommend that countries develop their own supplementary lists to go alongside the handbook. So we've really given you a real kind of whistle-stop overview of what's included within the handbook. We have now finished writing the handbook, and it's with rettsyndrome.org and their design team in the final stages of production. It will be available in January 2020 to download from the website of rettsyndrome.org in the first instance. As we've said throughout the project, our vision is that this would be a free resource that is available for people to download, and we would hope that it would also then be available through national parent associations, national Rett associations, organisations, and we're very happy to engage in discussions with different countries and associations and organisations from different countries about looking at how we might translate into languages other than English, as the initial language of publication will be English. We're very grateful to rettsyndrome.org for their funding of the project and for helping us to bring this idea to fruition. And we hope that it's something that really, once the handbook is published, is not the end of the project, but the start of a next phase where we can really start to work with different people in different countries to look at the implementation of the guidelines and how they might be adapted and developed in different countries and in different languages. We're also in some discussion about perhaps producing some extra materials and resources to go alongside the handbook, if you like, to set out a series of pathways or how-to guides. So again, we're very open to having discussions with people about how those future developments might work and to look with you at maybe sources of funding for future projects. I think that's about it for the moment. I'm going to hand back to you now, Paige, if you want to move us on to the final part of the webinar. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And we'll now move to the question and answer portion of our webcast. But before that, I want to thank you and express the many comments of thanks through the queue and that people have been submitting to me throughout your presentation. They have found it incredibly helpful and very rich, very comprehensive. And I think the key message that there are so many avenues to develop communication, but at the heart of it, fundamentally, it requires a multidisciplinary team to consider each individual. And that's what we know, that individuals with Rett syndrome are on a spectrum, and where they're beginning their communication journey takes a lot of effort and time to determine where to begin, and there's not just one cookie cutter approach. And I want to really emphasize that, because I know on social media I see examples all day, every day, of a spectrum of abilities of where people are in their communication journey. And I want those stories to be inspiring to those and not discouraging to others who are not quite there yet. And I really think that the work of Gill and Theresa and their entire team and the global contributors to this set of guidelines really embodies that spirit of to not be discouraged, begin where you are, and there are no limits. So thank you for that. Now, if I may, I'm going to go through the questions that have been submitted, and Jill, Theresa, will just leave the phone open for you to jump in, and you can both contribute to responses. Many of these things you covered in your presentation, but they are the areas of specific interest for our attendees. So feel free to go back to slides earlier in your presentation if you need to. So the first question that came in is from a parent whose daughter is 23 years old and uses a communication device, but very recently she's started doing a lot of yelling and vocalizing and has really turned away from using her communication device. And they're asking for comments of kind of what to do in a situation like that.
Okay, so I can start with that. And then Jill, if you can jump in.
Yeah, sure.
Individuals with Rett syndrome are just like us in that they change. And sometimes something that works at a particular time may not work at another time. However, first of all, what we think of, I think, a lot with our individuals with Rett syndrome is that we have to rule out any underlying medical issues. So yelling, sometimes individuals are unable to express things like pain or other discomfort through their communication devices. And so they have to resort to yelling or, expressing some kind of physical discomfort. So assuming that's all been ruled out, which I hope it has been, then what I might want to think about is I might want to look and see if the communication device in its current form is currently meeting her needs. It could be that in some ways she's outgrown it. There are maybe the vocabulary needs to be updated. Maybe her access method needs to be studied. Maybe there's a different kind of device that would be better suited to her current needs. So not knowing how long she's had the device, how successful she is, how large her vocabulary, it's hard to be more specific, but it probably would be a good opportunity for the team to sit down and to take a step back and say, well, what's really working? What can she communicate well? Where are the holes, and what do we think she's trying to communicate when she's yelling? Are we seeing this consistently in a particular context? And that maybe give you some insight as to how to begin to give her what she needs so she can be calm and communicate in a way so that others can read that message.
Absolutely. I think I will agree with everything that you've said there, Theresa. My immediate thought was to, again, to look at any changes in health status, which is exactly what you said, and we talk about in the guidelines, in terms of always being aware of monitoring somebody's health status, so changes in maybe seizure patterns, in sleep patterns, in respiratory issues, looking at gastrointestinal issues, a whole host of different features there, see if something's changed. And exactly, again, as Theresa said, I'd reinforce that, is the communication system continuing to meet and be suitable for the particular individual's current interests? Maybe those have changed, or the activities and the places they're going to have changed. Is there enough vocabulary, the right kind of vocabulary? And are all the communication partners acting in a consistent way? Do they all know how to respond to and use that communication system? But certainly working together with members of the girls' communication team to look at how she's communicating, what kind of function the yelling and the vocalizing is serving, and trying to find out where the kind of gaps are in terms of meeting her communication now, looking for the triggers for change.
Can I ask a question, a follow-on question to that? Because I think these are good answers, and they really are pointing to the, your encouragement that when and where possible to have a multidisciplinary team who are, we as parents and caregivers bring this to attention. We're observing. She used to be great with her device. Now she's not showing any interest. What's going on? And to bring that question to medical professionals to help rule out medical issues, to OT/PT to look if it's an access issue, to the SLP or educator. In your handbook, or do you provide any kind of tracking form or guideline to help parents perhaps keep a journal over a week to help maybe identify if there's a certain time of day or a certain, if it's right before she goes to the bathroom, or, things like that, to maybe help this multidisciplinary team see some trends that might help in situations like this?
No. Yes, and I think that's a great question. So we do not have something like that is so specific. That kind of thing was not something we gathered information on as part of our research. There are some tools that are available, some, say, forms or checklists that are available for, say, nonverbal users, where people are asked, okay, she's crying every day. Let's journal it. Let's see what happens before, what happens during, what happens after. Are there triggers for this particular behavior, so that you can see if there's consistency. But I think your question kind of speaks to something that Gill was alluding to earlier, that we have definitely seen as part of this project, these gaps where implementation of these guidelines could be benefited from resources like this. So where we'd say a pathway, here's how to get somebody who's not, an AAC user started on a system, and now here's how to troubleshoot. And these are the kinds of tools that could be helpful in trying to dig in to those in those situations when you're not sure what's going on.
Yeah, I think it's definitely something that would be very valuable to look at and develop further in the future. I was just looking at the list of, in the appendices, as we said, we have reference to different resources for assessment of communication and for development and tracking of communication goals. But I'm not sure that there's anything that exactly matches what you were just asking for, Paige. I don't think anything exactly like that came up through the research and the surveys that we conducted.
Okay. Thanks, and I didn't mean to put you on the spot with that question, but that the very nature of this question I hear asked all the time, and I thought, we have sleep journals, we have seizure tracking journals, perhaps this could be a good tool in the future that we could look at as a communication journal to help guide people to detect communication trends and troubleshoot when
I mean, we one of the things that we do actually talk about is the value of developing a personal communication passport, so that is about sharing information with different communication partners in different settings about how an individual communicates, and that may relate to different communication styles and different communication methods in different situations and different settings, but really helping so that when somebody moves into different environments, everyone can know how to interact with that person and how to interpret their behaviours. So kind of maybe slightly different from what you were just saying, but it's something that we do flag up in the handbook as being very valuable for each individual.
Excellent. I'm sure people will look forward to accessing that, and I hope that this helps answer the parent's question. I'm going to move to, in the interest of time, move to the next question in the queue, which is leveling up a little bit. If you could summarize and underscore for us the main difference between communication and AAC practice for people with limited purposeful movement in speech versus people with Rett syndrome specifically who have limited purposeful movement in speech. If you could summarize that would be wonderful.
Good question.
I think it goes back to the beginning of your presentation, Jill, but it's really just to get a quick summary. What's unique and different about people with Rett syndrome who have movement in speech and communication disorder versus others maybe who don't have a neurogenetic disorder diagnosis or don't have Rett syndrome, have something else?
I mean, I think
that you have found in your research.
From looking at the kind of, from following the literature through from sort of early descriptions of Rett syndrome, I think you can see a kind of a changing understanding of Rett syndrome. So certainly it has previously been something that's been described as being a leading cause of severe intellectual disability. And now what we're becoming increasingly aware of is that there is a greater range of cognitive ability with individuals who have to struggle with a lot of aspects, the features of Rett syndrome that we talk about, that prevent them from showing what they actually do understand and what their potential cognitive development could be and their potential communicative development. And I think one of the things that people with Rett syndrome struggle is partly the perception of other people, but it is very much that body battling against the respiratory issues, against the seizures, against the motor movement impairments, which may be the dystonic movements, or it may be the dyspraxic movements, and things like the increase in wait time, which we very clearly see. Those are features that are very specific to Rett syndrome, I would say, compared with other apparently similar movement disorders or speech disorders.
Yeah, I think that's, I completely agree with that, Jill. It's a great answer. And if I could add on to that, if we remember historically, Rett syndrome used to be considered an autism spectrum disorder. And as a matter of fact, many young people with Rett syndrome were initially diagnosed as having autism because of lack of awareness about Rett syndrome. And I think what the literature has shown and what we've seen, certainly is reported clinically, is one of the big differences between, say, nonverbal children who have autism and nonverbal children who have Rett syndrome is that the interest in social interaction is very high in Rett syndrome as compared to many children with autism. So that the intense eye pointing, the great eye contact, those are key differences that we see in individuals with Rett from individuals with autism. So though maintaining interest may be challenging in Rett syndrome because of a lot of the physically, the physical challenges and the medical challenges, the overwhelming interest in social interaction is much higher in that population from some other nonverbal populations like autism.
I think probably also where we talk about the sensory regulation issues and the heightened anxiety, they're also quite key features in Rett syndrome that can influence communication. And that whole, I think a lot of it comes back to that expecting consistency as well because of the interaction of all the features.
Yes.
Thank you, and I couldn't agree more. I have a couple of questions here that are related to eye gaze devices specifically. And I'm wondering if you can address these. I'm going to just kind of list them so that you can capture them because we are getting short on time here. But in terms of eye gaze technology, do you have one that you think works best for girls with Rett syndrome? Are there computer programs or eye gaze technology that work with Mac? And what has been your success with eye tracking devices with girls who are highly mobile in accessing those devices? Those are three complex questions, but they're all related to eye gaze, so I'm going to put them out there for you to try to tackle.
I would say we don't have any evidence from the information that we gathered to say that there is one piece of kit, one eye gaze technology system by one manufacturer, one supplier that works for everybody. I think there are a number of different systems out there using different eye tracking cameras, and different individuals will respond to different systems, but also it depends to some extent what's available in any particular country or by how it's funded. So I think it's very difficult to make a judgment as well on one particular device that across the world will be suitable for everybody. So that's kind of one answer that I would give. And I, to some extent, would say the same in terms of kind of software that's available as well. It will potentially vary according to the country and the language in terms of what's available and accessible and or funded. So it's very difficult then to make, again, very specific recommendations. And that's really why we would urge each country to develop their own resource list as a supplement to the handbook that can be offered alongside it to show the resources that are available in that particular country or language.
Yeah, I would agree completely. And I think that an individual is likely to be more successful if they are supported by communication partners who have been educated on how to use the technology. So you'll find in different areas that there are software programs or technologies that are more popular, so they are better known. And when you have that situation, you likely have a richer support system that can then help with troubleshooting and how to advance someone from, say, a small vocabulary to a larger vocabulary. So I think it's less about the technology and it's more about the strategies for implementation.
And the support, yeah.
Yep, yep.
Coming back to then the third question about, which I think, if I remember rightly, was about ambulatory individuals. We do actually give a couple of kind of tips, if you like, for using eye gaze technology with people who are mobile and walking. So, for example, maybe identifying in the home or in the classroom or a day centre room one particular place that an individual learns to walk up to where the device is, so that it's easily accessible and at a height that is appropriate for them to use, with the right kind of light conditions and so on. But we also then talk about opportunities maybe for having somewhere to go and sit if you're using it for maybe a longer interaction. But there are a number of different pointers that we give there.
We also give a recommendation that for someone who is ambulatory, they really should have a backup non-electronic set of vocabulary. So print off their page sets, have a board, have a book, so that they can either indicate on their own, or you can use partner-assisted scanning to help them communicate, because access to the electronic device may not always be reasonable when they're up and around.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. I think because of the excitement and the potential of eye gaze devices and eye pointing technology to get such complex thoughts advanced to literacy, there's a lot of enthusiasm and interest. We also have a lot of questions around other methods of communication, such as POD, where high tech is not available, and your thoughts on that. And I know that those a lot of these strategies are covered in the handbook. So in the interest of time, I'd like to say that the trend of questions that we're seeing, you covered, and we want to assure everyone that we're committed to follow up on these, which is get this handbook produced in 2020 available for everybody. That is so rich with links to everything from high tech to low tech, to communication partners, to strategies, resources of how to access this. But there are going to be things that will continue to make available across countries as the different countries are working with the authors to get country-specific access channels available to families. And within the US, we'll continue to work with our state reps to give state-specific information, because we know how varied that can be within the US from one state to the next. And I see a lot of people in our queue volunteering to say, oh, I'm happy to share how we did it in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I'm happy to share how we did it in Nebraska. And we welcome community input greatly, and we feel it's our job as a foundation to gather everybody's best success stories and share them so that everyone can leverage them. We also have a lot of trend questions from parents of women and adults, adult individuals with Rett syndrome who don't have access to team approach. And I was wondering if Gill and Theresa, you could give us some closing thoughts today of how the parent or caregiver who maybe has an adult with Rett syndrome or lives in a place where they don't have access to this multidisciplinary team to support them in their efforts. What encouraging words can you give to families that they'll be able to take from the handbook and use in their life if they don't have access to a multidisciplinary team? To start with communication.
Well, the
handbook itself, right? The handbook itself.
The handbook itself. But what Gill said, it's not going to be a recipe book, because it's kind of a foundation. This is what we know from the research. This is what is possible. These are best practices. Now, and we recommend trying to get to a Rett expertise center, if that, or a center of excellence in the US, you know, a clinic where people are informed. But we recognize, we truly do, that not everyone has access to those kinds of resources. You know, we know that not everyone has access to, say, consistent electricity. High gaze, you know, high-tech eye gaze is not even a possibility. But, you know, what can be done for my daughter, you know, what can be done for her to get her at least started on a path? And if you don't have access to a communication professional, that's where, because that would, if you can't get a whole team, at least somebody who knows about communication, and that would be a speech pathologist, or depending on where you live, an augmentative communication specialist, or a teacher or an occupational therapist. Those are the kinds of people who are interested in this. And if they can learn about Rett syndrome from you and with you, you at least could maybe make some strides in communication. But we've been talking about is, could we eventually develop resources for, say, a completely nonverbal communicator with not a lot of access to resources? How can you get started? And that would be more of like a recipe, like a step-by-step. And that is something we've talked about potentially for the future, because we recognize the need. We do. We totally do.
And I mean, yeah, just to add to that, because obviously the ideal would be for everyone to have access to at least a communication professional, if not to a wider team. But we do have some links in the appendices to some kind of free online resources as well that people can access for further information if they are completely on their own. Although ideally we would prefer that people had support from at least one other person with some expertise in communication.
Wonderful. And I think that leads us to our commitment to continue to offer webcasts just like this. So as the handbook becomes available, as additional resources become available, we invite both of you, Gill, Theresa, as well as many other communication experts that have contributed to this work and to this research, to join us again for future webcasts, so that everybody at all level of resources, access, and ability have at least this method to tap into the incredible communication potential that I believe is within each individual with Rett syndrome. And there's a lot that can be done, even if you don't have a lot of resources available. There's a lot existing within her that if you just believe in her and you slow down and you pay attention and you attend these webcasts and read the literature, you can get going, right? I truly believe that.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think that comes back to really what the heart, in some ways, what the heart of the whole guidelines is that statement about all communication partners should believe that the individual is capable of communicating. And it's not about everyone getting to the same end point, but that right attitude and that open-mindedness to be able to get to know and build a relationship with an individual, and to encourage them by looking at and reading their behaviours and giving feedback, helps to shape communication.
Well, thank you so much. In the interest of time, I'm going to make some closing remarks here. Thank you for making your contact information available. I hope everyone had a chance to look at that and write that down. I know that you are generally interested in helping each and every one of us pursue a rich communication pathway for all of the children that you have met, the ones that I have met, and we will continue to work together. But really, congratulations to the both of you and all of the authors. And we cannot emphasize enough how much we appreciate the years of hard work that it took you to reach out to all of those countries, the hundreds of professionals and the hundreds of families that responded to you with their experiences, their recommendations, their advice, and for you to wade through all of that information and come up with these evidence-based guidelines is really an incredible success. So thank you very much for being with us today and for continuing, your work. It's an ongoing process, and it will evolve and continue to improve over time.
Absolutely. And thank you for the opportunity to share information with people today.
Thank you all very much.
And thank you for giving us the preview. I know that you were a little hesitant to go ahead and do the webcast here in October prior to the handbook being completely available, but that is, that's the world of research and the world of publication. But we know it's early in the school year for many of our families, and you shared quite a bit of information today that I know is going to be helpful over the next few months while we get this published and out into the domain. So thank you very much for that.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Pleasure.
All right. Well, everybody, I hope that you enjoyed the information today, that it's giving you much food for thought, and that you're going to be reaching out to all of the professionals in your lives to share the link to this recording. You will receive it in your inbox in the next day or two. In addition, Gill and Theresa have gratefully shared their slides from today's presentation. So we will attach that to the email follow-up, and we will also post it to our website so that if you want to forward the slides in PDF form to anyone working with your children, you're welcome to do so, but we really encourage you to share the recording link. Okay, I have up next on my slide here, the topic for our next RettEd, which will be Tuesday, November 12th. And we are going to welcome Dr. John Killian, who's a longtime expert, very well practiced with neuromuscular scoliosis and the developmental issue of hip dysplasia in many individuals with Rett syndrome. Go ahead and register for that webcast on our website. And we are very much committed to continuing to do online virtual education monthly through our RettEd program for the remainder of 2019 and into 2020. But we also know that there's so much to be gained and learned from when we spend time together in person. So in 2019, we've had a series of very successful education days in the US. We have 2 more coming up in 2019 next week at Monmouth University, October 24-25, and the University of Rochester Medical Center in upstate New York has convened a wonderful Ed Day on November 2nd, and you can visit our website to look for registration information on those 2 events, and they are open to families. Our 2020 calendar of Rett education days will be published shortly. We have a great series continuing in 2020. So thank you for taking the time and the interest to improve the lives of your kids, your family. We have a complex disorder that we're dealing with, but the optimism and idea of making progress is one that we embrace, and we will continue to bring actionable, helpful information to you as a community. And we want to thank our sponsors for helping us bring that education to you free of charge. We want to thank each and every one of you who've been out there in October having fundraisers and strollathons and asking for donations online. As you can see, your dollars are at work for research in the area of neurorehabilitation, in the area of communication, helping you break through with actionable, meaningful results today. And we are continuing to invest in our research programs for clinical trials, for gene therapy, for all of the transformative things that we hope will further open up the abilities of our children. So congratulations to everybody who has participated. I do want to, in closing, pivot off of that idea about making progress and remind you that there are many ways that you can continue to contribute to the advancement of treatments and a cure. We want to thank you for contributing to this communication survey work And we encourage you to please stay engaged, keep an eye out. Please take the time. If we ask you to participate in a survey or a questionnaire, we don't do that lightly. We don't ask you to commit your time, which is very valuable, unless it is for an effort that really will contribute to the advancement of the field. We ask you to continue to consider enrolling in the natural history study, to think about organ donation if that time comes, to consider participating in one of the many clinical trials that are happening in the US and abroad at this time. If any of this seems out of reach, difficult for you to decide, we are here to talk to you. Just reach out at any time and we can talk to you about the different research opportunities that are available. Research participation is critical to making real change a reality, as critical as it is to continue fundraising, and we appreciate each and every trailblazer who commits to that. And it was your very participation that enabled the publication of these guidelines. So this is a real outcome to your real participation and engagement as a community. So at the end of this webcast, you will be asked to answer a brief survey. Please take the time to answer it. I personally do look at every single response and use it to frame our upcoming calendar of webcasts to make sure that we're offering you the most up-to-date current information that are trend issues in our community. So I look forward to seeing you next month, November 12th, on spine and hip issues. And please visit our website, rettsyndrome.org, for all of the upcoming cities and dates for Ed Days, Rett Getaway in 2020, and further webcasts. So at the end of every webcast, I like to remind everyone to just take a moment, close your eyes, think about what you learned today. Don't be overwhelmed by all of the things that we try to accomplish every day with our children. I know that list can feel very long, but I hope that through these education programs that we help you prioritize what can be achievable for your child and where he or she is on the spectrum of Rett syndrome. And if medical issues are priority right now, focus on those. Know that communication is there and you can get to it. Be confident, believe in your children. You've got this. And until we speak again, be well, try hard, and know that we are here working very deeply and committedly on your behalf. So thank you, and this concludes today's webcast. We'll see you next month.